Welcome to module number 7 of interpersonal communication class, the confrontation stage of conflict. You'll recall in previous modules we mentioned that researchers have discovered that all kinds of interpersonal conflicts tend to grow in certain stages. In a previous module we talked about the first stage, which is disagreement. That stage, if you'll recall, is when people understand there to be some kind of tension or some kind of friction between themselves and someone else, but the other person might not actually know that there's a conflict. Well, the second confrontation stage is quite different. In the confrontation stage, as the term confrontation suggests, it's evident to everyone there is a conflict. This is when you actually say to someone, "I've got a problem with you." This is when people can hear the voices that are raised. It's when you just know you're involved in a conflict because you're fighting with someone. Now, you might choose to label it as a discussion or a disagreement, but let's be honest, it's a conflict. And so researchers have found certain things are happening in the confrontation stage, both communicatively and otherwise, that if you understand them, can help make you a better communicator. So let's start with this. One of the things we know that occurs in the conflict or in the confrontation stage of interpersonal conflict is that people tend to habitually enter into and execute conflict. They use what are called conflict scripts. We know that generally people tend to communicate in relatively complex but very clear patterns. So that is to say, for example, that oftentimes when you first meet people, you tend to interact with them in a certain way. You might be shy, you might be outgoing, you might tend to tell the same kinds of stories, things of that nature. Well, when it comes to interpersonal conflict, conflict scripts reflects the idea that when we're involved in conflict, we tend to say and do the same thing, even though we're in conflict over different kinds of topics. So, for example, let's say that you've got a husband and a wife, and the wife often makes use of what's called a blaming script. The wife has it in her head that oftentimes the conflicts she's involved in all revolve around the fact that she had a pretty terrible upbringing. In fact, she wants to blame it on that upbringing. So if she and her husband are involved in a conflict about the way they're disciplining their children, the wife might blame it on the fact that her mother was a not good mother, and that's how she never learned how to parent, and that explains the conflict she's having now with her husband. Or it might be that the wife and husband are having a conflict over the spending of money. So once again, the wife blames it on the spending of money that she didn't receive instruction in when she was growing up. Now, we know from research that there are many, many different kinds of blaming scripts, but I want to share 6 of the most common of them with you right now. The first of which we've just described, which is a blaming script. People can be blamed, circumstances can be blamed, all sorts of things can be blamed. To understand that someone's using a blaming script is to listen for a recurring pattern where the word blame is used, or where it's evident that someone is trying to cast responsibility onto someone or something else. That's a blaming script. A second kind of script is a tantrum script. It's where people are throwing a verbal or a nonverbal kind of tantrum. Sometimes kids will put their hands over the ears and say, "na, na, 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 na," as if they're trying to tune out the world. Now, that's an obvious tantrum, and thankfully not many adults use that kind of a tantrum script. But some people will throw tantrums by storming off. Some people will throw tantrums by hurling insults at people. Some people will throw tantrums by folding their arms and refusing to talk. Each person might have his or her own individual way of throwing a tantrum, but you'll know it when you see it. A third kind of conflict script is what's called a guilt script. In a guilt script, what you're trying to do is you're trying to cast guilt on the other person for their role in the conflict, or even for bringing the conflict up. Guilt scripts are particularly helpful for many people because it allows them to shift the responsibility for the conflict off of their shoulders and onto someone else's. A fourth kind of conflict script is a victim script. This is when someone claims that they're the victim of mistreatment. They're the victim of not being misunderstood. They're a victim of circumstances. They may or may not actually use the word victim, but they paint a very clear picture that they are somehow being hurt or harmed because they are in a powerless role. A fifth kind of conflict script is what's called a bully script. Now, bully scripts are a bit different than the others because in a bully script, you're trying to exert power over people forcefully. Bully scripts can be seen by the way that people raise their voices, by the way they are talking down to individuals, the way they're threatening people, the way they're just trying to create an intimidation effect. And finally, the sixth type of conflict script is what's called a defensive script. And as the title suggests, defensive scripts are when people respond defensively in tone of voice or in verb by how they are interacting in conflict. So a defensive script, for example, will cop a kind of attitude whenever a conflict begins. And as the conflict unfolds into this confrontation stage, the defensiveness rises. Defensiveness can be evident by all kinds of sarcastic or snarky or hurtful comments. Defensiveness can be a tone of voice. It can be a kind of whining about the conflict that's occurred. Regardless of which of the 6 scripts that I've just talked about are used, the net result of all this is that there's a recurring pattern of behavior that people involved in the conflict can see. Now, it may be that the person using one of these conflict scripts isn't even aware of it, but at the end of the day, it's evident that something's going on here that's a habitual, recurring pattern of behavior. Now, a second idea that oftentimes can help us understand what's going on in the confrontation stage is what are called timing issues. We know that so much of how a conflict comes to be, and especially how it evolves, has to do with when the conflict occurs. So timing issues is a line of research that wants to ask the question, is there a certain time when conflicts are more or less likely to happen? For this married couple, for these 2 roommates, for these 2 co-workers, are there a certain set of circumstances that are more likely to give rise to conflicts than other sets of circumstances? And when we ask that question, 2 ideas come to the surface. The first of which is this idea of being blindsided. Being blindsided means that you're not prepared for the conflict. It comes out of the blue. It's unexpected. You didn't anticipate there being a conflict, and all of a sudden, there it is. We know in the research in family communication that many family situations have these blindsided kinds of things. So a child would get home from school, and the parent blindsides the child and starts a conflict almost immediately. Child wasn't expecting it. In fact, they were expecting a smooth transition from school to home to whatever comes next. But as that transition is being made, the parent comes right in and starts to involve himself or herself in a conflict with the child about grades or about the cleanliness of the room or who knows what. Whenever you blindside somebody with conflict, chances are pretty good you're going to have a more negative outcome to that conflict than if you prepare them for the conflict. Which is why, ironically, when someone says, "Come on in and sit down, we need to talk," in an odd way, you're preparing them for what's to follow. You're signaling to them that the conversation about to occur is likely not to be a pleasant one. And in the research, we find that when people are prepared for conflict in that manner, they're more likely to have a positive outcome than if they're blindsided. And then the other idea related to timing issues is this notion of a timing window. A timing window refers to a particular time of day when conflicts are more or less likely to occur. Or a timing window can refer to a particular point in a timeline when conflict is more or less likely to occur. So, for example, we know that conflicts between roommates typically don't occur early in the roommate relationship. So if you just move to campus in late August and get a new roommate, chances are pretty good you're not going to have conflict immediately. But about halfway through the semester, we begin to see more and more conflicts between roommates. That's a timing window. Or alternatively, we know that in a family setting, oftentimes when people are off away from the home at work or school or whatever, and they get back to the home, that first half hour or so when people are back in the home opens up a timing window when conflict is more likely to occur. In long-distance relationships, we know that oftentimes when people reunite after having been separated, it's quite common for there to be conflict shortly after that reunion occurs. In the morning, when kids are trying to get ready for school and parents are trying to get ready for work and get everybody out the door, another timing window opens up, and the research in family communication tells us that that's another time when in that context, conflict is more likely to occur. So as you can see, timing issues become an important part of what's going on in the confrontation stage. However, the most important idea that animates all of this confrontation stage is what's known as conflict styles. You might remember that earlier I said that everybody tends to have their own habitual recurring way of doing certain kinds of communication. That's when we talked about conflict scripts. Conflict styles is this idea that says that we each have our own way of doing conflict. The conflict script is more narrow. This notion of conflict styles is a much broader idea. You see, conflict styles takes up notions of how it is we see conflict and the way that we think conflict fits into the larger picture of our relationships. A conflict style, in essence, is much like the style of a painter or an artist or the style of an athlete. We all have our own styles that are partly unique to us, but also partly fitting a broader kind of a mold. And so the research into interpersonal conflict wants to look at those broader molds. And when we do that, we find that there are a handful of common kinds of styles. And so what I'd like to do here is run you through each of the different styles that research has identified. But before I do that, let me say a couple things about this whole notion of conflict styles. It's true that each of us does have our own kind of conflict style, but it's not like one size fits all. One of the things we know from the research is that our styles are contingent. What that means is it might be that with one person I have certain kinds of style, but with another person I have a different kind of style. So for example, with your parents, you might have a very competitive kind of a style where the confrontation occurs, there's a lot of bickering, a lot of significant conflict. But when it comes to your girlfriend or boyfriend, you might be an avoider, and you might flee from conflict. And so therefore, you might have very different ways of doing conflict based upon, contingent upon, who you're in conflict with. Now, these styles are also learned. They're not genetic. You don't inherit them from your family. There's nothing biological in your conflict style. We learn them typically from the experiences of growing up. And yes, in fact, we do learn these styles at a young age. Now, there is research to suggest that the most significant influence on your conflict style is the same gender parent. So, for example, it might dawn on you that you and your mom have rather similar conflict styles. The research would suggest that that becomes a kind of default setting. And by default setting, I mean it's the kind of thing that can change over time, but it is clearly identifiable. And speaking of changing over time, we know that your conflict style, in fact, often does that. As you mature, as you have different experiences, as you move into different relational contexts, it's quite common for your conflict style to change. So you might begin as a competitor, but then over time become more of a surrenderer or even a collaborator. Or you might have been a competitor with a previous girlfriend, but now in this next relationship, you become an avoider. Another thing about conflict styles is that they're not mutually exclusive. In a moment, I'll try and describe for you several different common conflict styles. But as I describe them, don't think that you're always that style or that you're exclusively that style. So for instance, when I talk about the competitor style, you may think to yourself, yeah, that's me. But yet then when I talk about the surrenderer style, you may think, well, but that's me also. The truth of the matter is that each of us is really not possessive of one particular conflict style, but we have an amalgamation of many of them. And so if you imagine a pie graph, it might be that a competitor is your most commonly adopted conflict style. With most people, most of the time, you're a competitor. But there are perhaps certain people or certain contexts where you become a surrenderer. And so we can say that your dominant style might be a competitor, but there are instances when you become a surrenderer. And that's okay. That doesn't invalidate the research on conflict styles, nor does it suggest anything abnormal about you. It just means you're human. And humans are complex creatures that are difficult to try and explain. And then, for our purposes, perhaps the most important notion of what happens with conflict styles is that they all have certain communicative behaviors. Competitors do certain things communicatively that make them competitors. Avoiders do certain things communicatively that make them avoiders, and so on. So with that backdrop, let's talk about the most common kinds of conflict styles. And don't worry, there are just a few of them. So what I'd like to do is describe each style in turn and then talk a little bit about the specific communicative behaviors that we find in each stage. Let's start with the first kind of conflict style. The first kind of conflict style is what's called a competitor. Competitors tend to see conflict as a win-lose proposition. The goal of a competitor is to win the conflict. Now, what we mean by winning might vary from person to person and conflict to conflict. But the idea is that in their head, they have something that for that person, as a competitor, suggests they've won the conflict. So, for example, people that are competitors oftentimes need to get the last word in because they think that if they can get the last word in, they've won. Or some competitors think that if they can present the more logical, rational case and prove that the other person is being irrational, then they've won. So as a competitor, the key might be to ask yourself, what do I think is winning in this particular conversation, in this particular conflict? So one of the things we know about competitors is that they are often drawn into spontaneous conflicts. It's as if something just kind of clicks in and they begin to find themselves in a conflict. Many times they feel blindsided, or many times they're blindsiding others. So communicatively, there's a lot going on with these competitors. They like to engage in public fighting. They like to be visible in their fighting, whether it be at a restaurant or a circle of friends. They'll constantly stick up for themselves because if conflict is all about winning, it's always better to be winning in a visible context than in a less visible context. So don't be surprised to find competitors wanting or enjoying fighting in front of the kids or fighting in front of other friends. One of the things we know is that competitors oftentimes are more often male than they are female. Now, there's some socialization effects going on here, and I'm not saying that females aren't competitors. Far from it. What I'm saying is that if I draw a pie graph that's labeled gender of competitors, the larger slice of that pie is going to be male. Or to put it differently, competitors are more likely to be male than female. And when you have a female who's a competitor, we chalk that up to different experiences, different personalities, and it's all good because, again, we're trying to explain people. But nonetheless, in the research, there's a very clear delineation that suggests that males are more apt to be competitors than are females. So communicatively, competitors are doing a lot of things. Competitors, for example, are making faulting statements. It's important to competitors to be able to point out whose fault it is in a given situation. They make use of what's called dumping, which is where they'll take different topics and different ideas that might or might not be related to this particular conflict and dump them in hopes that in doing so, they gain some kind of an advantage. They make use of what are called out-of-bounds statements, where they'll say things intentionally to hurt people, or they'll go there because they know they can gain an advantage of some kind. They make use of guilt trips to try and make the other person feel guilty about how they're behaving in the conflict, or feel guilty about what led to the conflict. They make use of what's called prescription, where they're telling the other person what they ought to think, or how they ought to feel, or what they ought to do, or what they should not have done. They use personal attacks. They hurl insults. They sometimes will try and cut people down to size. They will themselves deny any responsibility for the conflict or for how they're behaving in the conflict. As I said earlier, they love to get in the last word. They'll threaten you sometimes, not necessarily with physical harm, but they'll threaten you by talking about what you don't want to talk about or how you don't want to go there. Sometimes they'll raise their voice and shout. They make heavy use of sarcasm. One of the things they often do is make use of what are called always and never statements. You always leave the toilet seat up. You never think to ask for my opinion before purchasing things. They oftentimes, in the midst of a conflict, will commit turn-taking violations, which means they'll interrupt the other person, they'll talk over them, they'll do whatever they can to maintain control of the conversation so that they're the one speaking, the other person is the one listening. They make use of superiority statements. Superiority statements are when you make a claim that you would never have done something, that my way of doing things is better than your way of doing things. It's obvious to everyone that this is the way that it is. There's a sense of certainty and a sense of know-it-all that goes along with being a competitor. Now, as you might imagine, with that list of things that I've just shared with you, competitors oftentimes are doing things that make it more likely that a conflict will not be well managed. In fact, it's true in the research, competitors, especially hardcore competitors, do more often find themselves in conflicts that end up in situations that are detrimental to the relationship and to the people involved in that relationship. So if you're a competitor, you need to be careful. If you're a competitor, you're not doomed. By no means am I saying that competitors are, by definition, inherently going to be the kinds of people that do damage to relationships. But what I am saying is that if you're a competitor, the chances are pretty good that you're more likely to do things that are detrimental to the relationship. So you've got to be careful. As Peter Parker's uncle said in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So if you're a competitor, you have to make sure that you use that power responsibly. The second kind of conflict style is what's called an avoider. And as the term suggests, avoiders do their best to avoid conflict. To them, conflict is a threat. To them, conflict is something to be avoided because in their mind, it always ends up being negative. Or in their mind, to be involved in a conflict is to symbolize something deeper in the relationship that's a problem. So sometimes people become avoiders because they believe that boyfriends and girlfriends should never fight, and that if they do fight, that's an indication something's wrong. And so because they don't want to raise the possibility of something being wrong in the relationship, they avoid conflict. Now, it's true that if a greater proportion of competitors are male, a greater proportion of avoiders are female. Now, that makes sense given what we said earlier in this course about gender differences in communication. You'll recall that earlier in the course we said that females tend to see the world through a lens of connection. Well, conflict tends to threaten connection. Conflict creates the possibility that whatever connection has been made might be somehow severed. And so therefore, for many females, conflict becomes threatening. Now, I'm not saying that there are no males who are avoiders. Far from it. But again, if I draw a pie graph that's labeled the proportion of avoiders, the largest piece of that pie is going to be represented by females, the smaller slice of that pie by males. And again, remember everything we've said, that these styles are contingent, they're not mutually exclusive, and all of that. By the way, one close cousin to the avoider style is what's called the indirect fighter. The indirect fighter technically is avoiding conflict, but they make such heavy use of those covert articulation strategies we talked about in the last module that in reality they're having conflict. It's just kind of conflict with a lowercase c. It's not conflict with a capital C. It's the kind of thing that we might say is the first or second levels of conflict. It's tension, it's friction. There are just a lot of covert articulation strategies. And in the research, we find that indirect fighters oftentimes end up in situations where they're doing detriment or harm to a relationship. So if you're an indirect fighter, you might be acting passively aggressive. If you're an indirect fighter, you might really be in conflict. You just don't want to admit you're in conflict. Okay, so communicatively, what's going on with avoiders? Well, as you might imagine, communicatively, avoiders are doing whatever they can to ensure the conflict doesn't come to fruition. So, for example, they'll adopt a very pessimistic attitude. They'll say things like, I don't want to talk about that. We'll always just end up fighting about that. So they're pessimistic about whether talking about something is likely to lead to any kind of a positive result. Sometimes they will deny whatever has been said to them. It's much like a witness, a witness in a court context where they simply deny knowing anything. Or the subject of a police interview simply says, no comment, no comment, no comment. There's this direct denial. Sometimes that leads to a stalling kind of a tactic, where people won't answer, or where people will try and do what they can to avoid being in the same room with someone. Physical avoidance, in fact, is a very common technique, non-verbally, that is used by avoiders. I've had students that will avoid seeing me on the sidewalk. They'll turn and walk the opposite direction. They'll walk down the hallway and turn around and go the opposite way when they see me coming because they're avoiders. And they think we're going to have a conflict, and so they physically try and avoid even bumping into me. They will verbally deny the existence of a conflict. They'll tell themselves and tell the other person that there's no problem here. They'll deny there's any difficulty. They'll use silence and simply not respond to what's said to them. Sometimes they'll try and shift the topic, right? So if a roommate is trying to have a conflict with his roommate about whose turn it is to clean the room before room check, it might be that the shifting of the topic is when the guy wants to talk not about that, but wants to talk about video games or about basketball scores or who knows what. So the idea is that avoiders will oftentimes communicatively try and steer the conversation away from what might be conflict, or they'll avoid interacting with someone entirely because they're afraid that if they do interact with that person, there's going to be a conflict. So we have competitors and we have avoiders. Now, generally, when a competitor and an avoider are paired up in a roommate situation, for example, or in a romantic relationship, there is a slightly greater likelihood of a negative outcome. That's because oftentimes the avoider is so intent on avoiding conflict that it becomes difficult because the competitor oftentimes is trying to draw that avoider into a conflict. That oftentimes creates a climate of greater negativity in the relationship. Now, generally, when two avoiders are paired together, okay, that strongly correlates with a greater increase in the likelihood of negative outcomes. In other words, you don't want two avoiders getting together for obvious reasons. If they're both avoiders and they're avoiding the problem that needs to be talked about, then you've got a situation where that problem is never addressed, it continues to fester, and the relationship cannot address it. It's like not putting a Band-Aid on a wound. Now, you might be asking, but what happens if two competitors get together? Well, the research there is mixed. The research there finds that if the competitors can have a well-managed conflict, then everything is fine. The research also finds that in certain kinds of cultural backdrops, two competitors can be just fine. So, for example, in intercultural research, there are some ethnic groups that tend to have more strident, more significant, more kind of friction-laden types of interaction, but they realize that that's just the way things are done, and so there's no significant detriment. But if you take someone from that kind of a cultural backdrop and drop them into a different scenario well, then everything changes. Generally speaking, two competitors does raise a greater risk of negative outcome when it comes to conflicts, but not necessarily so, and certainly not to the same extent that you might think that it is. All right, so let's talk about the third kind of conflict style. It's what's called a surrenderer. So surrenderers are a bit different than either competitors or avoiders. Surrenderers are often drawn into conflict, and like competitors, sometimes they will do much of what competitors do. But the key to a surrenderer is that at some point in the conflict, they give in. They surrender. That is to say, they will end up yielding their own interests. So, for example, if you have a surrenderer who is a girlfriend, and she's dating this guy, and they have this conflict over the amount of time the guy has been spending with one of his ex-girlfriends. He's trying to be friends with her, he's trying to help her out, and the current girlfriend doesn't like that. So they have a confrontation about it. In fact, they have many conflicts about it. But the thing is, when she gets to the confrontation stage, after they've gone back and forth and maybe yelled a little bit, she always gives in. She always says, okay, fine, just do whatever you want. Now, that's not what she really wants. She wants her boyfriend to stop spending time with his ex, but she surrenders or she gives in because at some point she feels like she's getting nowhere, or at some point she's just tired of arguing. And so for whatever reason, surrenderers capitulate. They tend to give in. They're not compromising necessarily, though that might be it, but a compromise implies that there's something in it for both people. So a compromise can actually be a good thing. Surrenderers aren't so much compromising as they are surrendering, running up the white flag and declaring relative powerlessness. If I were to draw a pie graph to try and link gender to the notion of surrenderers, we would find, in fact, that a greater proportion of surrenderers are female than male. Again, not to say that males can't be surrenderers, just to say that a greater proportion of surrenderers happen to be female. And the most common explanation for that in the research is because of the way we socialize females in American culture. In my oral communication class, I talk about research that finds that females feel a greater responsibility for the management and continuance of all kinds of relationships. Males feel less responsibility. So since females feel a sense of greater responsibility for the relationships, it makes sense that after a conflict has gone on for a while, that in this confrontation stage, the female would surrender, because at that point the surrendering is a way of repairing the relationship. So if you think of the confrontation stage as rupturing the relationship, the repair comes with the surrendering and feeling greater responsibility for the maintenance of the relationship, and females would be more apt to be surrenderers composed to males. Surrenderers, of course, can do many of the things that avoiders do, many of the things that competitors do, and many of the things that the next style we'll talk about in a moment does. But the key to a surrenderer is the surrendering. It's the yielding of their own interests. Now, one derivative of the surrenderer is what's called a pseudo-accommodator. A pseudo-accommodator is someone who pretends to give in and then just acts in the exact same way. So, for example, it might be that in this particular girlfriend-boyfriend argument about the time the boyfriend is spending with his ex, it might be that the girl says, okay, fine, just get whatever you want. So she seems to accommodate him, and the guy thinks that it's okay for him to continue to spend time with his ex. In reality, it's not okay. So the girlfriend is going to continue to perhaps repeatedly request he not do that, or continue to use covert articulation strategies. She's going to imply that she's going to do things differently. In reality, she doesn't. As a teacher, there have been many instances where my students have been pseudo-accommodators. We'll have a rather difficult conversation that has confrontation in it. A student will say that he or she is going to attend class more often, or stop texting in my class, or stop being disruptive, but they know full well that they're not going to really change. And so, pretty soon their attendance begins to drop, they continue to be disruptive, or who knows what. They are pseudo-accommodators. Well, the fourth common conflict style is what's called a collaborator. And as you might know from the title collaborator, it's two people working together. The whole idea of a collaborator is that they realize conflict is inevitable. It's a fact of life. The reality is that people in any kind of relationship will sooner or later have conflict. So for collaborators, they want to try and manage that conflict well. And they think the way they do that is through calm, mutual respect. The calm part refers to the way that the conflict is managed. The calm part means the emotions are not running away with you. The calm part means that you can talk about things in a reasonable, sequential manner. The respect, mutual respect part of that is the idea that says that as the conflict unfolds, as it is managed, everything that is said and done must have an eye toward communicating respect for the other person. So, for instance, collaborators tend not to talk over people or interrupt people. Collaborators tend not to use guilt trips. Instead, collaborators tend communicatively to do what is necessary to maintain a sense of calm in that moment and at the same time to communicate respect of the other person. There's a general taking into account of the other person's needs and wants. There's a lot of listening. The whole idea of collaborating is that you get someone that wants to work with the other person. Well, as you might imagine, collaborators are quite rare. Compared to competitors and avoiders and surrenderers, fewer people in the world are collaborators. That's unfortunate because collaborators are the gold standard. We would want more people to be collaborators. One of the things we know about collaborators is that when they do compromise, the compromises that they agree to, the compromises they offer, are the kinds of things that preserve the interests of both people. They're typically done within boundaries. They're typically done in a way that tries to honor the interest of those involved. Collaborators are partly collaborators because of the way they go about seeking resolution and solution to conflicts, but they're also collaborators because of the way they conduct and manage the conflict. Whatever else is going on, unlike avoiders, unlike competitors, these collaborators have an eye on not damaging the underlying fabric of a relationship. You see, too often competitors are simply concerned with winning, and so they take steps that damage the underlying fabric of the relationship. That's what the personal insults, for example, do. That's what the dumping does. Avoiders, on the other hand, are so intent on avoiding conflict that they will, in what they do, unintentionally do damage to the relationship because what needs to be addressed doesn't get addressed. And surrenderers, well, surrenderers are oftentimes in the same situation as both competitors and avoiders. Because they always surrender, they're never able to really get beyond the conflict. Collaborators, on the other hand, are able to keep the relationship's underlying fabric strong. So what are collaborators doing communicatively? Well, one of the things they're doing is they're making very clear, good descriptive statements. They're saying things like, when you do X in situation Y, I interpret it as Z. So for example, the girlfriend says, when you continue spending time with your ex-girlfriend, it makes me feel as if I can't trust you. It's a very clear descriptive statement. They're oftentimes demonstrating understanding and concern for the other person's position. In fact, they try and draw out from the other person what their position is. They try and identify and articulate what that position looks like. So a collaborator, if it's the female of my example of the girl and the guy's ex, if the female is a collaborator, she might try and draw out from him exactly what it is he wants, and she will try and articulate what it is she wants. Now, they both also might need to make some concessions or compromises, which is often what collaborators are doing. Collaborators also accept responsibility for their part of the conflict. They accept responsibility for what's going on that got them to the point of conflict. And one way collaborators do that is by identifying common ground. Common ground is simply the suggestion that people might have more things in common than they realize, that the basic interest of the people involved might overlap more so than people realize that they do. So collaborators are pretty good at identifying those places of overlap and building a resolution of the conflict based upon that. So all of these things create a situation where collaborators, compared to avoiders or surrenderers or competitors, are better positioned to be able to have well-managed, helpful conflict. Now, collaborators, as I said a moment ago, are the gold standard. I mean, in a perfect world, two collaborators would room together. In a perfect world, two collaborators would marry one another. We don't live in a perfect world. But one of the things we know is that whenever you have a collaborator present in a relationship, that relationship is more likely to have a positive outcome from its conflict than if a collaborator is not present. So if you are a collaborator, good. You're in a better position than someone who's an avoider or who is a surrenderer. If you are a competitor and you're dating another competitor, you better beware. If you're a competitor and you're dating a collaborator, then things are, statistically speaking, likely to be better for you. So let me wrap up this conversation about conflict styles by reminding you that throughout this course, our goal is to try and explain human beings. Human beings are complicated. Human beings are difficult to try and put into a box. The research is trying to put people into a box by saying, hey, here's a style called competitors and here's what they do, and that might fit you. But remember, because we're trying to explain people, because people are complex, we can never entirely explain everyone. And as soon as you put a person's name on it, all bets are off. The research is intended to explain the aggregate. More males are competitors than females. That's the aggregate. The more you do these kinds of things communicatively, the more likely you are to be a competitor. But of course, because we're trying to describe human beings, you have to remember that everything is idiosyncratic. And that's why in module number 1, I shared with you the fact that there's a tension between universality and idiosyncrasy. So there is some universality here. There are, in fact, conflict styles. But there's also some idiosyncrasy in that Brian Simmons, or you, might enact these styles very differently. So in the confrontation stage, this crucial development in the multi-stage process of interpersonal conflict, there are some things to look for. I'd encourage you to think about, what is your conflict style? With whom am I more likely to adopt a particular conflict style? What kind of a conflict style would I want in the person that I room with or that I'm dating? I think all these things are important to consider. So here's where we are. We've looked at the disagreement stage of interpersonal conflict, and we've looked at the confrontation stage of interpersonal conflict. In the next module, we'll look at the next couple of stages and learn more about how interpersonal conflict works.